The cowboy froze when he saw blood on her scarf hanging from the north fence, but the kiss she gave him hours earlier was what truly terrified him. Snow hammered the ranch windows while Zeke Turner shoved open the warehouse door, revolver shaking in his hand. Somewhere inside, chains rattled. A lantern swung overhead. Then he heard Delilah's voice, small, weak, alive. Outside, the storm swallowed the road back home, and Zeke realized he might already be too late. If this story pulls you in, stay a while and ride along with us. The snow started before dawn and never truly stopped. By the time Ezekiel Turner rode down into Dry Creek, the whole town looked buried halfway into the mountain. Wind pushed white powder through the crooked main street and wrapped itself around hitching posts, wagon wheels, and frozen porch rails. Zeke pulled his coat tighter at the collar and tied his horse outside Grady's trading post, beside 3 other half-frozen animals. One of them coughed steam into the air. The bell above the door groaned when he stepped inside. Warmth hit him first. Then the smell of tobacco, coffee grounds, wet wool, and kerosene lamps. "Storm's settlin' in hard," Grady muttered from behind the counter. "You wait another day, you'd be snowed up there till spring." Zeke nodded once. He always nodded instead of talking more than necessary. For the next 20 minutes, he moved quietly through the store gathering supplies. Salt pork, coffee beans, lamp oil, 2 sacks of flour, nails, feed grain, a fresh leather strap for the south gate. Outside, wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. "Need somebody help load your wagon?" Grady asked. "I'll manage." Grady leaned both elbows on the counter. "You still up there alone?" Zeke counted coins into the old man's hand without answering. That was answer enough. The ranch sat nearly 12 miles north of Dry Creek, tucked between pine ridges where snow gathered deep and silence settled heavy. Most folks avoided the place after Eli died. Even before that, visitors had been rare. Zeke preferred it that way. He lifted the flour sack onto his shoulder and headed toward the back entrance to load the wagon himself. That was when he saw her. A woman sat near the dead coal stove behind the building where delivery crates were stacked against the wall. Snow dusted the shoulders of her dark coat. She hadn't brushed any of it away. Her gloves were worn through at the fingertips. A small wooden box rested in her lap beneath both hands like it mattered more than the cold. She looked toward the street where a team of ranch horses passed slowly through the blowing snow, not staring, just watching. Grady stepped beside Zeke and lowered his voice. "Name's Delilah Boone." Zeke said nothing. "She cooks, worked camps up north, railroad men mostly." Grady scratched his beard. "Quiet girl, keeps to herself." "Why's she sitting out here?" Grady hesitated. "Folks hire her a while, then they don't." Zeke glanced toward the woman again. She never looked back at him, not once. Wind pushed snow through the alley. Her shoulders trembled slightly beneath the coat, though she held herself stiff like she refused to let the cold win. "She got family?" Zeke asked. "Not around here." That answer carried more weight than the words themselves. Zeke looked toward the sky. Clouds were lowering darker over the mountains now. Another hour and the pass north would disappear under whiteout conditions. He turned back toward her. "My ranch needs a cook for winter." Grady blinked. "That so?" Zeke ignored him and stepped closer to the woman. She finally lifted her eyes halfway, not fully to his face, more toward his chest. "My place is north of Dry Creek," he said. "Storm'll trap us up there till thaw if this keeps on." Delilah stayed silent. "I can pay monthly. Room upstairs. Hot meals, works honest." Still silence. Then slowly she looked toward the horses outside again. The wind carried their snorts through the alley. Something changed in her face. Not hope exactly. Maybe memory. After a long moment she nodded once. That was all. The wagon creaked hard under the supplies on the ride north. Snow hit sideways now, thick enough that Zeke had to lean forward against the reins. Delilah sat beside him, wrapped in a wool blanket, The wooden box held tightly against her stomach the entire ride. Twice he offered to place it beneath the seat to keep it dry. Twice she quietly said, "No thank you." Her voice surprised him. Soft, careful, like someone used to speaking only when necessary. The road narrowed as they climbed higher into the pines. Wind howled through the trees and carried loose snow across the trail in pale ribbons. "You cooked railroad camps?" Zeke asked after nearly an hour of silence. "Yes. You know how to butcher?" "Yes." "Bake?" "Yes." Nothing more. No extra stories, no questions about him. Zeke found himself strangely grateful for that. Most people talked too much around silence, tried to fill it. She let it sit untouched between them like it belonged there. By the time the ranch appeared through the storm, dusk had nearly swallowed the mountains whole. The house stood dark against the snowfields, with smoke barely curling from the chimney. Barn lanterns swung in the wind beside the corrals. Delilah stared at it quietly. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. Zeke climbed down first and tied the horses. Kitchens through the back. Inside, the ranch house smelled like cedar smoke and cold iron. Delilah paused near the doorway, taking everything in without moving far inside. The scarred kitchen table, cast iron stove, tin coffee pot hanging beside the sink, a pair of old snowshoes near the wall, not curiosity, calculation. Like she was learning escape routes without meaning to. "I'll bring your things up after supper," Zeke said. She nodded. That evening she made stew from leftover venison and potatoes she found in the cellar. Nothing fancy. Still, it tasted better than anything Zeke remembered eating in months. He noticed small things while she worked. How she rolled her sleeves carefully above her wrists. How she flinched when the wind slammed the side door too hard. How she never once turned her back fully toward him. After supper, she washed dishes while snow hammered the windows. "You can take the room above the kitchen," Zeke said. "Thank you." He lingered awkwardly near the doorway. "You'll hear coyotes sometimes, mostly near the ridge, all right? And the pipes knock when it gets below freezing." Another nod. Zeke finally grabbed his lantern. "Good night, Miss Boone." "Good night, Mr. Turner." Near midnight, Delilah woke suddenly. At first, she thought it was the wind. Then she heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, circling outside the kitchen. The sound stopped near the back door. Her breathing shallowed. Carefully, she slid from bed and reached for the small iron poker beside the stove upstairs. Another step. Then silence. She moved down the staircase slowly, every board creaking beneath her weight. Moonlight spilled pale across the kitchen floor. The back door rattled softly once. Delilah tightened her grip on the poker and pulled the door open fast. Cold wind rushed inside. No one stood there, only snow, and a trail of fresh boot prints leading away from the kitchen toward the horse barn, disappearing slowly beneath the storm. Delilah stood in the doorway, with the iron poker clenched in both hands, while cold wind pushed against her nightdress. The prints vanished near the barn. No lantern, no voice, nothing except the restless shifting of horses behind the wooden walls. Then a low cough came from inside. She froze. A second later, the barn door creaked open, and Ezekiel Turner stepped out, carrying a saddle blanket over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw her standing barefoot in the snow. "Miss Boone?" She lowered the poker slowly. "I heard somebody walking." Zeke glanced toward the ground, then toward the house. Storm woke the gelding. Fence chain came loose. He noticed her bare feet almost immediately. "You'll freeze standin' there." Delilah stepped back inside without answering. Zeke followed a moment later, bringing cold air and snowflakes with him. He shut the door carefully behind himself and hung the lantern beside the sink. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then he pointed quietly toward the stove. "Fire's dying." She crouched near it automatically and fed another piece of cedar into the coals. The flames climbed slowly. Zeke stood near the table, pulling snow from his gloves. His beard carried flecks of ice near the jawline. "You always sleep that light?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded once like he understood more than she'd actually. Said by morning the storm had buried half the corral fence. Wind still screamed through the pines, but the worst had passed. Delilah was already awake before daylight. Zeke came downstairs pulling on his work coat and stopped short when he smelled bacon grease and fresh corn cakes warming on the stove. The kitchen looked different, cleaner somehow. Coffee cups dried upside down beside the sink, flour sacks stacked properly against the wall, the cracked spoon bucket gone from the counter. Delilah stood near the stove rolling dough with quiet concentration. "You didn't have to start this early," Zeke said. She shrugged lightly. Couldn't sleep anymore. He sat at the table while she poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug with a chipped handle. The coffee was stronger than what he usually made. Not bitter, just honest. Outside, snow slid heavily from the roof in long sheets. Inside, the kitchen stayed warm enough for the windows to fog. For the first time in a long while, breakfast didn't feel like survival. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Before dawn, Delilah lit the stove and carried fresh water in from the pump wrapped in burlap so it wouldn't freeze against her hands. Zeke repaired fences, checked horses, and hauled feed through knee-deep snow, while smoke curled steady from the chimney all day long. Sometimes he returned near noon and found venison stew simmering low beside fresh biscuits, cooling beneath a cloth towel. Sometimes he came back after dark and caught the faint sound of humming upstairs before the floorboards went quiet. She rarely asked questions. He rarely offered answers. Still, the silence between them began changing shape, less sharp. One afternoon, Zeke came in carrying frozen harness straps over his arm and found Delilah standing on a chair trying to hang wet scarves near the stovepipe. Without a word, he grabbed a hammer from the drawer and disappeared outside. An hour later, he returned with a row of sturdy hooks nailed beside the kitchen hearth. Delilah stared at them a second. "You didn't have to do that." Wall was empty anyway, but later that evening he noticed all her scarves hanging there, neatly drying beside his coat. A few days after Christmas, Ruth Ann Holloway arrived at the ranch in a squeaking wagon, pulled by an old mule named Jasper. Ruth Ann was nearly 60 and spoke like she expected the world to argue back. "Well," she said, the moment Delilah opened the door, "you're prettier than Ezekiel described." Zeke looked up sharply from the table. "I didn't describe anybody. That's why I had to see for myself." Delilah laughed softly before she could stop herself. The sound surprised all three of them. Ruth Ann spent the afternoon shelling beans near the stove, while snow drifted outside the windows. Every time horses moved too fast near the barn, Delilah's shoulders tightened almost invisibly. Ruth Ann noticed. Older women usually noticed things men missed. That evening after supper, Ruth Ann pulled Zeke aside near the porch. "She startles easy." Zeke glanced toward the kitchen, where Delilah stood washing dishes. "I noticed." "Whatever happened before she got here," Ruth Ann said quietly, "it ain't finished with her yet." Before Zeke could answer, wind slammed the shutters hard against the house. The oil lamp flickered out. Darkness swallowed the room. For a moment nobody moved. Then from somewhere inside the black kitchen came Delilah's voice, soft, low, singing something old and slow that sounded older than the mountains themselves. Zeke stood completely still, listening. The house had been quiet. For so many years he'd forgotten walls could hold music. When the lamp finally came back on, Delilah stopped immediately and turned away, like she regretted letting anyone hear it. But something had already changed. That night, Zeke didn't sleep in the barn office beside the horses, like he usually did during storms. He stayed inside, near the warmth, near the sound of another person breathing upstairs. A week later, they rode into Dry Creek together for supplies. The streets were slushy now where wagon wheels had cut through old snow. Delilah stayed close to the wagon while Zeke loaded sacks of grain outside the mercantile. Most folks barely glanced at them. Then a drunk ranch hand stumbled from Amos Pike's saloon carrying a whiskey bottle by the neck. His eyes landed on Delilah. Recognition hit him instantly. "Well, I'll be damned," he slurred. "Thought Amos sold you off last year." The street went still. Delilah's face drained pale beneath the cold. Zeke straightened slowly beside the wagon. The man laughed once, ugly and careless. "Guess some folks always come back." Before Zeke could move, Delilah climbed onto the wagon seat with both hands trembling against the reins. "Please," she whispered without looking at him. "Can we go?" Across the street, Amos Pike's beneath the Dew Saloon awning, watching everything through drifting cigarette smoke. And when Zeke met his eyes, Amos smiled like they already knew each other. The wagon wheels rolled hard over frozen slush as Zeke drove them out of Dry Creek without another word. Delilah kept both hands tight around the edge of the seat the entire ride home. She never once looked back toward town. Snow clouds dragged low across the mountains. Thin gray light spread over the pine ridges like smoke. Zeke finally spoke when the ranch gate came into view. "You know him?" Delilah stared ahead. "I know men like him." "That ain't what I asked." The horses slowed as they entered the yard. For a long moment she said nothing at all. Then quietly, almost too soft to hear, she answered, "I used to cook near the northern rail camps." Her fingers tightened inside her gloves. "Some folks there disappeared." Zeke climbed down from the wagon first and began unloading feed sacks. "Amos part of that?" "I don't know." But the pause before her answer stayed with him long after sunset. That night, wind pushed hard against the cabin windows. A new storm was building somewhere west of the mountains. Delilah worked silently in the kitchen while venison stew simmered low over the stove. Zeke sat nearby repairing a leather bridle strap beneath lamplight. The house felt smaller lately, not uncomfortable, just closer. Every sound carried differently now. The scrape of her spoon against cast iron, the slow creak of his chair, the soft rhythm of boots crossing old floorboards. At one point, Delilah reached for a jar from the top shelf and lost her balance slightly. Zeke caught the chair before it tipped. His hand closed around the wood beside her leg. For half a second, neither moved. Delilah looked down at him. "Not away, not this time." Then she stepped down carefully and murmured, "Thank you," simple words. Still, something warm settled quietly into the room afterward. The storm arrived 2 days later. By dawn, the ranch had disappeared behind walls of blowing white. Snow hammered the roof. Wind screamed through the corrals hard enough to shake the lantern hooks beside the porch. Zeke spent most of the morning fighting frozen gates and dragging hay through drifts nearly waist deep. When he came back toward the house near dusk, he spotted Delilah near the chicken coop through the storm. She was struggling against the wind, trying to force the coop door shut, while frightened hens scattered through the snow. "Delilah," he shouted. The wind swallowed his voice. By the time he reached her, her hands were red from cold and her scarf had blown halfway loose. "I almost got 'em all," she said breathlessly. "You shouldn't even be out here." Together they forced the coop shut and stumbled back toward the house through snow thick as flour. That night Delilah barely touched supper. By midnight Zeke heard movement upstairs. Not footsteps, restless sounds, a muffled gasp. He climbed the stairs and found her burning with fever beneath heavy quilts, her face damp with sweat despite the cold room. Delilah twisted weakly against the pillow. "No," she whispered hoarsely. "Please don't lock the door again." Zeke grabbed fresh water from the basin and folded a cool cloth against her forehead. Her eyes stayed shut. She wasn't seeing the room anymore. "Easy now," he murmured. Her breathing turned ragged. "They said we were being moved south," she whispered. "Said we'd get paid." The words broke apart after that. Zeke sat beside the bed, through the long, dark hours, feeding wood into the stove upstairs and changing the cloth whenever it grew warm. Around 3 a.m, Delilah suddenly grabbed his wrist hard enough to stop him moving. Her eyes flew open in panic. For one terrible second, she looked straight through him, like she was somewhere else entirely. "Don't let them take me back there," she whispered. Zeke leaned closer. "They ain't here." Her grip trembled violently. Then slowly, piece by piece, she recognized him. The fear in her face eased just enough for her shoulders to lower. Zeke didn't pull his hand away. Outside, snow crashed from the roof in heavy sheets. Inside, the fire popped softly in the stove. Delilah finally drifted back asleep, still holding on to him. Morning came gray and quiet after the worst of the storm passed. Weak sunlight pushed through frosted windows. Delilah sat wrapped in blankets near the upstairs stove, while Zeke carried up coffee and dry toast on a tray balanced awkwardly in one hand. "You cook terrible," she muttered faintly after one bite. Zeke stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, a real smile this time. Small, tired, but real. He found himself smiling back before he could stop it. Later that evening, the fever finally broke. The house had gone quiet except for the sound of wind easing outside. Delilah stood near the kitchen window, wearing one of Ruth Ann's old shawls, while snow drifted softly across the yard. Zeke stepped inside, carrying fresh firewood. "You should still be upstairs resting." "I was tired of staring at the ceiling." He set the wood beside the stove. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Delilah looked at him carefully. "You stayed." Zeke frowned slightly. "Course I did." "No," she said softly. "Most people don't." The words settled between them, heavier than silence. Zeke looked down at his hands. Old scars across the knuckles, cracked skin from winter work. When he finally answered, his voice sounded rougher than usual. "Lost enough people already." Delilah studied him quietly. Then she stepped closer, slow enough to give him time to move away. But he didn't. Her fingers touched lightly against his coat sleeve first. Then, before either of them could think too hard about it, she rose slightly and kissed him. Soft, quick, warm, despite the cold air around them. The moment ended almost immediately. Delilah stepped back like she regretted it the second it happened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But Zeke was still looking at her like the whole room had changed shape. For the first time in years, he said her name, without distance in it. "Delilah." Neither noticed the kitchen door shifting slightly open from the wind outside. The next morning the fire had burned low. Snowlight filled the kitchen pale and blue. Zeke came downstairs first, then stopped cold. The back door stood wide open against the wind. One horse was gone from the barn. Outside near the north fence, something dark and moved against the snow. He walked toward it slowly. Delilah's scarf hung tangled in the wire fencing, and across one edge of the fabric, blood. For a second, Zeke could not move. Wind pushed through the open kitchen door behind him, carrying the sharp smell of snow and horse sweat from the empty barn. He grabbed the scarf from the fence wire carefully. Still warm, his stomach tightened. "Delilah!" The sound tore across the yard and vanished into the storm. No answer came back. Zeke checked the barn first. One saddle was missing. So was the gray mare usually kept near the south stall. Fresh tracks cut hard through the snow beyond the north pasture gate. Not riding tracks. Wagon tracks. Heavy ones. He went back inside only long enough to grab his rifle, coat, and ammunition belt. Then he noticed something beneath the bed upstairs, the wooden box. Delilah's box. She would never have left it willingly. Zeke pulled it free slowly. Inside rested a faded photograph folded at the corners. A young black girl stood beside Delilah, in front of what looked like a church tent somewhere farther south. Maybe Missouri, maybe Kansas. The child could not have been older than 8. Beneath the picture sat several papers tied with twine. Northern Freight Camp, labor transfer receipts, names, amounts owed, signatures. Some marked paid, some marked missing. Zeke stared at Amos Pike's signature stamped across one corner in dark ink. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters violently. By noon, he rode into Dry Creek through blowing snow thick enough to blur the buildings along Main Street. The town looked half asleep beneath winter weather. Smoke drifted low from chimneys. Horses stood tied outside the saloon with frost clinging to their manes. Amos Pike was exactly where Zeke expected him to be, leaning beneath the saloon awning with a cigarette between his fingers. "Well now," Amos said calmly. "Looks like your cook wandered off." Zeke dismounted slowly. "Where is she?" Amos exhaled smoke sideways. "Mr. Turner, women leave, especially ones carrying trouble." Zeke stepped closer. "I found wagon tracks, and I suppose every wagon in Montana belongs to me now." The deputy stood nearby outside the sheriff's office, pretending not to listen. Deputy Warren Cole adjusted his gloves nervously when Zeke looked toward him. "You see anything last night?" Zeke asked. Warren hesitated too long. "Storm was bad," he muttered. "Could barely see across the street." Amos smiled faintly. "There you have it." Zeke's jaw tightened hard enough to ache. He wanted to drag Amos into the snow right there. Instead, he turned away. Because Delilah was still out there somewhere. Alive or not, he did not know. Ruth Ann opened her cabin door before he even knocked. "You found something," she said immediately. Zeke handed her the papers from the wooden box. The old woman read silently near the stove while coffee simmered behind her. Her face slowly changed. "Oh, Lord," she whispered. "You know what this is?" Ruth Ann nodded once. 5 winters ago, there were women working the rail kitchens north of Black Elk Pass. Colored girls, mostly. Some widows. Some runaways. She looked up at him. A few disappeared. Disappeared where? No one asked too many questions back then. She folded the papers carefully. "Folks," said Amos, "helped move labor east for the railroad camps." Zeke stared into the fire. Then Ruth Ann spoke again. "She didn't leave you willingly." "No." The answer came fast. "Certain." Outside, snow fell heavier against the windows. By dusk, Zeke was already riding north. The pine forests beyond Dry Creek swallowed Sound whole. Snow layered thick across the narrow mountain trail, muffling hoofbeats beneath the trees. The farther he rode, the colder the world became. Near midnight, he reached an abandoned supply station beside the old freight road. One lantern still burned outside. A stable boy no older than 16 stood shoveling snow near the porch. Zeke tossed him a silver coin. "You seen a wagon pass through here?" The boy glanced around nervously before nodding. 2 men. 1 woman. "When?" "Before sunrise." "Which way?" The boy pointed toward the canyon road leading deeper into Black Elk Pass. "She was fightin' them," he said quietly. "1 man hit her." Zeke felt something dark move through his chest. He rode hard after that. Branches snapped under frozen wind overhead. Snow whipped across his face, sharp as gravel. Then finally, lights. Dim lanterns flickering near an old rail transfer camp buried between cliffs and pine trees. Several wagons stood outside the broken warehouse. Men moved crates near the loading platform, and from somewhere inside, a woman screamed once. Then silence. Zeke dismounted behind the trees and moved closer on foot. The old warehouse doors rattled in the wind. Coal dust coated the snow black near the entrance. Inside, he spotted them. 3 frightened laborers huddled near the wall, and Delilah, locked behind iron storage bars near the back room. Her wrists were bruised, but when she lifted her eyes and saw him through the shadows, something inside her face nearly broke apart. "Zeke." One of Amos's men turned suddenly. "Hey!" The entire room exploded into movement. Crates crashed sideways. Lantern lights swung wildly across wooden beams overhead. Zeke slammed 1 man against the wall, while another grabbed for his revolver. Then Amos Pike stepped from the office doorway, holding a pistol steady in 1 hand. His voice stayed calm. Cold. "You're making a mistake over a woman nobody keeps." The barrel pointed directly at Zeke's chest. Snow blew through cracks in the walls behind him. Delilah's breathing caught sharply. Then Amos pulled the trigger, and Delilah threw herself forward. The gunshot cracked through the warehouse like splitting timber. Zeke hit the frozen floor hard as Delilah slammed into him. A lantern crashed nearby. Glass shattered. One of Amos's men yelled something, but the roaring wind outside swallowed half the words. For a second, Zeke could not understand what had happened. Then Delilah gasped sharply against his chest. His hand came away warm with blood. Delilah. She tried to push herself upright, but her right arm gave out instantly. The bullet had torn through the top of her shoulder. Not deep enough to kill. Still bad. Too much blood for comfort. Amos backed toward the office doorway with the pistol still raised. His face had changed now. The smooth smile was gone. "You should stayed on your ranch," he snapped. Another gust slammed the warehouse doors open wider. Snow blew through the room in violent white sheets. One frightened laborer rushed past during the confusion. Then another. Zeke grabbed Delilah with one arm and pulled her behind a stack of freight crates, as another shot buried itself into wood above them. Coal dust drifted through the air. Delilah's breathing shook. "You need to go," she whispered painfully. "Not happenin'." "Zeke, I said no." He tore a strip from his coat lining and pressed it hard against her shoulder wound. Her jaw tightened, but she never cried out. Outside, horses screamed somewhere near the loading wagons. Then suddenly Deputy Warren Cole appeared in the warehouse entrance holding a rifle with both trembling hands. Everybody dropped the weapons. Nobody moved. Not Amos, not the remaining guards. The deputy looked terrified, but for once he had actually come. Amos laughed coldly. "You got no idea what you're walking into, Warren. End of the line, Amos." Another loud crack split the room. This time Amos fired first. The deputy ducked sideways as the bullet shattered a lantern hanging near the doorway. Flames burst briefly across spilled oil before Snow and Boots crushed them out again. Chaos swallowed the room. One guard bolted toward the back exit. Another disappeared into the storm outside. Amos turned and ran straight through the freight doors into the canyon darkness. Zeke almost followed. Almost. Then Delilah's hand caught weakly against his sleeve. That decided it. He stayed. By dawn, the storm had buried most of Black Elk Pass beneath fresh snow. They found Amos Pike 2 miles down the canyon trail, beside an overturned wagon half buried in ice, frozen solid against the rocks. Nobody in Dry Creek spoke much about him afterward. Maybe because too many people had known pieces of the truth already. Maybe because winter had a way of burying ugly things fast. 3 days later, Delilah lay upstairs in Zeke's ranch house while Doc Mercer changed the bandages on her shoulder near the bedroom stove. "You're lucky," the doctor muttered. Another inch lower, and this'd be a different conversation. Delilah gave a tired nod. Zeke stood near the doorway the entire time holding a fresh kettle of hot water, without realizing it had gone cold. Recovery came slowly after that. Some mornings Delilah could barely lift her arm enough to button her dress properly. Other days she sat quietly near the kitchen window, watching snow fall over the corrals while her untouched coffee turned cold beside her. Zeke never pushed conversation. He simply adjusted things around her without asking, moved heavier pots lower, split extra wood before storms, left her favorite blue enamel mug warming near the stove every morning before daylight chores. Small things, the kind lonely people notice. One evening, Ruth Ann stopped by carrying fresh bread wrapped in cloth. She found Delilah folding laundry, one-handed at the kitchen table. "You're thinking about leaving," the old woman said plainly. Delilah lowered her eyes. "This town won't forget what happened. Neither will Zeke." Silence settled softly between them. From outside came the distant sound of Zeke hammering loose fence boards near the stable. Steady, patient, like always. "He deserves peace," Delilah whispered. Ruth Ann looked toward the window. "That man hasn't had peace in 20 years. Late February brought the first softer thaw. Snow still covered the valleys, but water dripped steadily from the barn roof during afternoons. One morning Delilah came downstairs carrying her travel bag. Her shoulder still hurt beneath the sling. Zeke stood at the kitchen counter, repairing harness straps. He looked at the bag once. Nothing else changed in his face. "You headin' somewhere?" "I think I should." The leather strap in his hand stayed still for a long moment. Then he nodded once. If that's what you want, no argument, no pleading. That somehow hurt worse. Delilah swallowed hard. I don't want trouble following you. Zeke looked down quietly before answering. Too late for that. But he still did not ask her to stay. The next morning she woke to hammering outside. Heavy hammering. Voices. When Delilah stepped onto the porch wrapped in her coat, she stopped cold. Several ranch hands stood near the old kitchen shed carrying lumber and paint buckets. New windows had been installed overnight. Fresh smoke curled from a repaired chimney. Zeke climbed down from the ladder, holding a wooden sign beneath one arm. Without ceremony, he walked to the doorway and mounted it above the entrance. Delilah stared at the painted letters. Turner and Boone Ranch Kitchen. Her breath caught softly. Not hired cook, not temporary. Her name, beside his. Zeke stepped back, wiping sawdust from his gloves. Figure folks from Dry Creek gotta eat somewhere. Delilah looked at him for a long time. The cold morning air drifted white between them. You sold horses for this, she said quietly. Zeke shrugged once. Didn't need that many. That was all. No speech, no grand declaration. Just truth. The kind built slowly over winter nights and shared coffee and staying when things got hard. A year later, the ranch sounded different, warmer, alive. Snow covered the pastures again, thick against the fences and pine trees beyond the hills. Inside the kitchen, fresh bread cooled beside the stove, while laughter echoed down the hallway. A little girl ran barefoot across the wooden floor, chasing a rag doll with loose stitching. 8 years old, dark curls bouncing wildly. The same little girl from the faded photograph. Delilah caught her gently before she crashed into the table. Careful now. The child giggled breathlessly. Outside, bootsteps crossed the porch. Zeke entered, carrying cold air and snow across his coat shoulders. The little girl ran straight into him. You promised sledding after supper. I remember, he said, trying not to smile too much. Delilah stood near the stove, watching both of them. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, she no longer looked like someone waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Later that night, after the lamps burned low, Zeke quietly hung the old scarf beside the kitchen hearth. The same scarf once caught bloody against frozen wire fencing. He adjusted it carefully on the hook, then stepped back. No words were needed anymore. The house itself sounded different now. Floorboards creaked upstairs. A child laughed somewhere down the hallway. Coffee simmered low before dawn, and through the frosted windows of the ranch house, warm light still glowed against the snow. Maybe that's what stayed with me most about Zeke Turner and Delilah Boone. Not the gunfire, not the storm, not even the night she vanished. It was the sound of a house slowly coming back to life. A chair scraping across the kitchen floor before sunrise. Boots drying beside the stove. A tired man finally hurrying home instead of finding excuses to stay out in the cold. A woman who spent years bracing for loss, finally setting down her suitcase without fear. And maybe, if you've ever gone through a season where the world felt quiet in all the wrong ways, maybe you understand that kind of healing too. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in small things. A cup of coffee left warming on the stove. A lantern kept burning late at night. Someone staying when leaving would have been easier. Zeke never promised Delilah a perfect future. He simply made room for her inside the life he already had. And for people who've spent years surviving alone, that kind of love can feel bigger than words. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you're listening from, and what moment hit your heart the hardest. And if stories like this bring you comfort after a long day, there are still more quiet towns, winter roads, lost souls, and second chances waiting for you in the next story down the trail.